it's not a problem, because content should not be a problem. It's what we think, what we create, what we speak about, but not everybody thinks that way. So Dr. Mueller is going to speak about this. Another hand for Dr. Mueller, please.
Okay, so nothing like the after lunch slot to get you all excited. So I'll try to be as provocative as possible. So we're going to begin with kind of a historical. No, this isn't working again. All right, so notice that I've given it a positive title rather than content regulation. I'm talking about freedom of expression. Can you read that?
No.
Barely.
No, better than your blue and black.
Let me think.
I'm a recovering graphic designer, sorry.
Oh, okay. Blue and black?
The one that you had a piece of blue, I think it had black on it.
Oh,
Text
okay.
with black on top of it.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
No
That was product of conversion from the slides then. But anyway, yeah. So let's begin with an understanding of how this idea of freedom of expression, where it came from historically, and particularly how it led to the sort of liberal democratic ideal of freedom of expression, which is now highly challenged in the world. So in the Western liberal tradition, the idea of free expression and what ultimately culminated in the U.S. First Amendment really comes from the religious warfare of the 17th century. That you had basically sort of a religious monopoly by the Catholic Church, which was then disrupted by the Reformation. And we had schisms. We had people believing that one group of people had the Word of God and another didn't, right? And because at that time state power was linked to church doctrine, this led to enormous conflicts, literally more than 100 years of fighting, persecution, various kinds of attempts to have the government decide who was right and who was wrong when it matters of religion. And to make a long and complicated story ridiculously short, at some point, both the Enlightenment liberals and just practical politicians said, enough is enough. Let's decide that the church is one thing, the state is another, Let's try to separate those two things so that people can coexist. And there will be something called tolerance, meaning that I may not agree with your right, I may not think that you're saying the right thing, but it doesn't mean I have to try to kill you or jail you, right? And in addition to that, there was a concept of natural rights, which often had religious roots in the Western tradition, that you have rights that are given to you by God, that you have free will, and it is your moral responsibility to exercise that free will, and then you will be responsible for either going to heaven or hell, but nobody's supposed to make those choices for you. Of course, nowadays the idea of free will has become a bit more secularized, but the fundamental point is, people can believe what they want to believe, they can pursue their beliefs insofar as they don't abridge the rights of other people. So that's where the idea of freedom of expression comes from, essentially. It was an attempt to separate religious doctrine from the state, to give individuals the right to make their own decisions as to who they associate with, as to what they believe, and as to what they can express. Now, there are three different aspects of the right of freedom of expression that you need to keep distinct, because they actually are different rationales for having it. One of them is the natural rights idea, that basically is just, I'm a human being, by my very nature, I need to express myself, I have a right to express myself, nobody can interfere with that unless I'm harming them. That's the rights-based approach. It doesn't matter in this approach whether what I say is true or false. It doesn't matter whether my freedom of expression contributes to society or not. It's just my right. All right, that's a very strong position. There's a separate but sometimes joined idea about freedom of expression, which says that it's the only way to arrive at the truth. That you can never really know what's right or what's wrong unless we're free to debate and discuss the different viewpoints. And unless you feel free to do that, the truth will get smothered or it will get suppressed. People will be afraid to say it. A good example of that is the old story about the emperor's new clothes, right? Everybody can see that the emperor has no clothes, but nobody's going to say that because, they're afraid they'll get into trouble. The emperor is a very powerful man. And so nobody says that, and we have this ridiculous spectacle of a ruler parading around with no clothes on because everybody's afraid to tell him the truth. Imagine that writ large about major issues of public policy. How many of you are familiar with the China's great leap forward in the 1950s? Right? Where you have a charismatic dictator. If he doesn't like you, you're in deep trouble. You may not even be alive the next day. Nobody's going to tell him he's wrong, even though, literally 25 million people starved to death because of this crazy policy that we're going to build steel mills in our backyards instead of farming. So freedom of expression has a very practical value. This is more of a utilitarian or practical justification for freedom of expression, that we need it to figure out what is true and what is false. And implicit in this belief is that the truth will win in a fair contest. That if you have competing ideas, people will go for the true one. Now lately people have become much more cynical about this idea because of the whole fake news thing. But in general, this view says that if people say false things, the answer is to say true things and to try to persuade people. It's not to have an official, centralized arbiter of truth who regulates what people can say. And the third element here is even more practical. It says that freedom of expression is needed in a democratic system to keep public officials accountable. That means if you cannot criticize public officials, you cannot actually make them serve the will of the people, because your ability to expose what they do or talk about what they do will be suppressed. And once that happens, then the government officials will be unaccountable. So we have these three different elements of freedom of expression that all have their distinct political significance. Now, despite all that, there are all kinds of ways in which we regulate speech. This is a list of some of the main ones. One of them is obscenity and indecency. In various ways, in various forms, every society is suppressing or making illegal certain forms of obscenity. And of course, there's a spectrum of opinions in which, a very conservative society might, want women to cover up their heads, and another more permissive society might allow them to, go topless on public beaches. But everybody regulates something, and one core consensus point really around the world is something like child pornography, in which it is, almost, it's hard to find anybody who would defend that form of expression. Then there's national security. And as we discussed when we were discussing cybersecurity, that's a tricky one, because clearly if your society is under threat from an external enemy, then some forms of secrecy might be necessary as a practical matter to defend your society from a threat. So in war times, or even in times of threatened war, you will typically see various kinds of restrictions imposed on what public media can say and what people can do to oppose their government's effort to be at war. How many of you have ever been defamed, or thought you had been defamed? Every day. Olivia, have you ever been defamed?
All the time. A guy called Milton something.
I wrote a blog post once if you didn't like mine. So defamation, libel, and slander are various bodies of law that vary greatly across society that will regulate the way you can criticize people. And so some of these laws might be very strong and restrictive. For example, in the UK, defamation, you can defame somebody, or you can be accused and convicted of defamation simply for saying something bad about somebody. Whereas in the US, you're not going to get convicted of defamation unless, you can prove that it's wrong and you had a intentional purpose of harming somebody with your statements. So libel, slander laws are forms of regulating expression. Securities fraud, or various kinds of economic regulations, all actually regulate very stringently what kinds of information you can release, or what kinds of information you must release, and what time you release it. This is designed to make stock markets function more fairly, so that if you have some insider information about a company, you cannot exploit that to the detriment of other shareholders in the company or other people involved in the stock market. As we all know, if you're familiar with the ICANN environment, there's a continuing tension between intellectual property rights and freedom of expression. So you might use a name, and a trademarked owner of that name might not like the way you use it, and they might sue you. You might register a domain that matches a trademark, and maybe it's a word like Apple that you think you have a right to use, but the trademark owner thinks they have the exclusive right to use that name as a domain name. So you're going to possibly have some legal conflict. And then in societies that have a history of ethnic conflict, then you frequently see certain forms of speech regulation related to what we now call hate speech or incitement. So Germany, with its abhorrent past of the Nazis, is really sensitive about any form of public expression that invokes the Nazis. And so they ban it. In the US, on the other hand, it's not illegal to be, or even to support Nazis or to wear Nazi insignias, even though hardly anybody likes those viewpoints. It's respected. Their ability to hold those viewpoints and express them is respected legally. And in countries like Singapore and India, where you have certain kinds of ethnic tensions, then there are stricter regulations about what you can say in certain situations that might be perceived as creating a conflict among ethnic groups. So have I forgotten any kinds of speech regulation that are significant? Yes?
Catalonia?
Catalonia. Okay, so, well, that was just sort of political suppression, good old-fashioned censorship, I think.
That would count as,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
so that wouldn't count as censorship in regards to the internet? As far as that?
I can't hear you.
Did that count as censorship?
Did that? Yes, definitely. They didn't want there to be a vote about autonomy, and they went from not wanting to have the vote, or from stopping the vote, to stopping people from speaking about the vote because they thought that would contribute to popular support for having the vote. So that was definitely a form of political censorship, and they preemptively shut down domains and websites that were advocating or supporting the vote on secession from Spain. So even people who were very much against seceding from Spain didn't necessarily think that that kind of censorship should be taking place. But that's a good example, a great example of how, what kind of debates you get into with freedom of expression. You have to say sort of, I don't like what you're advocating at all, and I think it's dangerous and bad, but you can go ahead and say it, right? It's very hard for a government that feels threatened to respect that right. So, along comes the internet. We have, 500 years. If you date the beginning of modern mass media to the printing press, which is probably what you should do, we have about 500 years of experience with various forms of censorship, with linking control of technology to control of speech, for example, by licensing presses, as they did in the early English history. Along comes the internet, and again, what does it do? It creates global compatibility among data communication. It takes everybody by surprise. Before that, if you wanted to have public media in a particular country, you had to get a broadcast license, or you had to print the newspaper there, or you had to somehow smuggle it in through customs borders to get it distributed and sold there. Now suddenly you just hook up a computer and you can get information from anywhere in the world without any gatekeeper. This was obviously quite revolutionary. It transcended jurisdiction, and it meant that all of these discrepancies in laws that I've been talking about, these different approaches to things like defamation, slander, libel, national security, suddenly they're all in one big global pot. At the same time as that is happening, we have digital convergence, which is basically erasing the boundary line between a newspaper and a website and a motion picture, right? So many countries have different regulations for a newspaper than they have for a television program, and they have different regulations for libraries than for television programs. Suddenly all these distinctions are broken down. Everything is digitized. Everything is being delivered through a single channel. And that creates all kinds of interesting legal issues about freedom of expression. So that leads us back to the so-called fragmentation issue, or the politically incorrect balkanization issue, which is actually a better word for it than fragmentation, because nobody's fragmenting the internet, they're balkanizing.
It's not always appreciated by a sub-region.
Yeah, the Balkans don't want to admit that they're balkanized. That's the problem. But what do you have? You have a bunch of smaller and smaller political units subdivided, right? And yeah, it's kind of a painful reminder, and I wonder how much trouble I'm going to get into for saying this, but, well, maybe it's a good example of freedom of expression.
Self-regulation.
Self-regulation, right. So basically it took governments by surprise. You know, it was like, we don't have any controls in place. There were really interesting debates in the mid-90s when the internet was just starting to spread about, you know, well, this website is showing a video, so does that mean we apply our television law to it? And if you look at the television law, it's like, oh, there can only be 3 channels or something. There's all kinds of strange and inappropriate regulations that would apply to one medium versus the other. So one of the pressures is that governments try to start superimposing their national laws on the internet by engaging in blocking and filtering. So you ask them, why are you doing this? Why are you blocking and filtering? For example, if you discover somebody is doing child pornography, they're distributing it digitally, obviously that's illegal, so why don't you go arrest them and confiscate their servers and do those other kinds of things? And they would say, oh, but they're outside our jurisdiction. We can't do anything except block them. And one of the interesting things that happened here is that in the name of these obviously bad things like child pornography, some countries would start implementing block lists, and then somebody would leak the list of blocked URLs, and you would discover that actually most of the blocked things were not child pornography, they were just pornography. Some of which was not even illegal under their laws. So that was an example of why some people are critical of these block lists. But on the other hand, there is a clear practical problem with trying to regulate speech that's taking place outside of your jurisdictional borders. So here are the key drivers of what has created pressures for content regulation. We've already mentioned child pornography, there's copyright, there's hate speech, there's privacy issues, there's so-called fake news and foreign subversion. So if you're in the United States right now, you say, oh, it's so terrible, the Russians are infiltrating social media, setting up fake accounts, doing bad things with these fake accounts, manipulating our public opinion, fomenting conflict among our groups. If you're in Russia and China, you say, oh, isn't it terrible, the US is creating this internet which has all this speech that's critical of Russia and our government coming from different sources around the world, and we're just protecting ourselves against this violation of our sovereignty. I don't mean to imply that the US position and the Russian position are morally equivalent. I'm just saying politically, if you look at what they say and what we say, there's a symmetrical nature to it. Now, one of the interesting things that happened, go back, and I'll pick up on this theme later, is because of this jurisdictional problem, more and more of the work, of the operational aspects of content regulation has been delegated to the private sector, and particularly to the large platforms, the social media platforms that more and more of us are relying on. So how many of you are Facebook users? Okay.
And abusers.
What's that?
And abusers.
Facebook abusers. How many of you are Facebook abusers? And how do you abuse Facebook, man?
I post a lot, I do like a lot of statuses, especially Javier statuses. I do a lot of likes.
Okay, so you're just a serial poster, that's all?
Yeah.
Oh, that's not very abusive.
Some of us
Anybody?
are stalkers.
Oh, I do love them.
Yeah, if you're looking for background or somebody, you stalk them and figure out what.
So those of you, I feel a little disabled here because I don't have a Facebook account and don't really use it. Sure, I have LinkedIn.
Hashtag winning.
So tell me, how do you feel as Facebook users about this viewpoint that you were kind of manipulated either by Facebook itself or by trolls or people who are using Facebook to put stuff in your feed that, I don't know, does bad things to you?
So I feel like I might be a little bit different user, but I'm more informed than the general public, I think. So I tend not to read or believe everything I read. And there are a lot of things that come up in my feed that I don't expect. But typically I'm only looking for a specific outcome when I go on Facebook. I'm looking at specific friends and subjects, and then I'll take it off Facebook to go get facts.
Anybody else? No. Okay. So, as we'll see, a lot of the pressure for dealing with the problems of content on the internet is being pushed into the hands of the platform operators. So, to some extent, governments have responded to this by implementing blocking and filtering around the world, and this map, which is, I think, I can't remember the exact name of the website, but they have a really nice little graphic here. You can click on any country and they have a list. This is probably based on the Freedom House information about, where they rate the freedom of different countries. How many of you are familiar with Freedom House? Okay, so they do a pretty good job of assessing the degree to which countries are democratic and free in the liberal sense. And as you can see, the dark red countries are not free, and the pink ones are partly free, and the white ones are supposedly have minimal forms of content regulation by states. Remember that, states.
What's the gray?
Gray means they have no data.
Canada has no data.
Excuse me, Canada? Where is that?
Right there.
Oh, okay. Yes.
When was the date of this?
This is very common. This is the latest Freedom House report. It just means that in this particular report, they didn't have data on all of these countries. It doesn't mean the data doesn't exist. It just means, if you've ever done a study, you know that it's hard work to systematically compile data. So, give them a break. They've got a lot of countries in there, and if you're in a gray country, it's no offense, really. Don't worry about it.
It's just that the UK, for example, has got the child-friendly internet stuff these days, which is one of the worst filtering systems that is like widespread everywhere.
True, and in fact, I think in the relative scheme of things, that is minimalistic compared to what many other countries are doing. And maybe they don't even consider that to be an imposition on freedom of expression. I'm not sure what their criteria were. But I know what you're talking about, and indeed, the Internet Watch Foundation is one of the pioneering responses to the presence of child pornography on the internet. And originally it was in this weird halfway house between state action and private action. So they essentially would be a hotline where people could report sightings of illegal content, or presumably illegal, or thought to be illegal content. Then they would evaluate it, and they would report it to police. And it worked quite well within the jurisdiction of the UK. In other words, they really succeeded in eliminating a lot of the really bad stuff through this, what we would call pure production of content regulation. It's just the wisdom of the crowd. People reporting things, having some agency that kind of evaluates those reports. And that's how much of the social media works too, right? You've seen this, report this content on YouTube, or the button you press when you think something is bad or illegal. And then that sort of sends reports to the operator of the platform, and then they can decide whether to take it down or not. But the interesting thing is, once they started figuring out how do we deal with content that is outside the UK jurisdiction, that's when they started doing a filtering list. And originally that too was private and voluntary. It was like IWF would produce a list of URLs that they thought should be filtered or blocked, and the internet service providers would voluntarily adopt this list or not. And in the early days, very few of them did. And then, as Olivier indicated, the government started putting pressure on all of the internet service providers to pretty much fall in line. So even though the list is created by private actors and is nominally not part of a law, it becomes almost uniformly applicable as if it were a law. And that's the interesting thing about the direction that content regulation is taking. Now, we can't talk about censorship without also talking about circumvention technologies. How many of you have heard of this term, circumvention technology? How many of you have not heard of this term? I have no idea what I'm talking about. Well, the Tor is not really a circumvention technology per se, but it is an anonymizing that makes it possibly easier for you to avoid censorship. So circumvention technology means these are technical tricks that can allow you to avoid censorship in your country. Frequently they involve what's called virtual private networks, or proxy servers, in which you are actually accessing the internet through a point that is outside the country that's doing the regulating. So virtual private networks were particularly popular in China. I had all these Chinese friends that I met in the ICANN environment, and they would send me a tweet, and I would say, "What are you doing on Twitter? It's supposed to be blocked there." And they would say, "Oh, we're just using a VPN." Now, in the last year or two, Mr. Xi Jinping has really cracked down on VPNs, which is a very dangerous sign that the Chinese are really getting even more serious than they already were about VPNs. About censorship, I should say, because the attitude, which is quite, actually a very practical and reasonable one, used to be among the Chinese power elite that, the people who do this are well-educated elites. Half of them travel to the U.S. anyway, or they're educated there. They know what's out there. It's the masses of people we don't want doing this, and most of that stuff is in English anyway, and so the ordinary Chinese person can't read it, so who cares? Let there be this safety valve. And oh, by the way, the corporations that are doing business in China, they really want access to all this information, so again, it's nice to have a little safety valve. The fact that the Chinese are turning away from this idea now is pretty disturbing. Because they really are, it is really getting hard to crack down on VPNs. And I'll tell you who else is cracking down on VPNs. So how many of you have tried to, who are not living in the United States, have tried to access Netflix? Yeah. So it used to be that you could actually be a subscriber to Netflix, but because of copyright licensing policies, if you were in Germany and you were pretending to be a subscriber in the United States, the rights that you had to access certain content would change completely depending on whether you were in Germany or whether you were in the United States. So they didn't want people from Germany using VPNs to access Netflix content, even if it was Milton Mueller, who happens to be traveling in Germany and is paying Netflix a gigantic sum of $17 a month to access all of that content. It means when I'm sitting lonely in a hotel room after a SIG, I cannot even look at a movie that I have paid for, right? You should be up in arms about this injustice. All right. So, in addition to all that, at some point during the Hillary Clinton's tenure as Secretary of State, there was an explicit initiative from the U.S. government that we are going to promote circumvention technology, that we are for internet freedom, and this is a matter of foreign policy and public diplomacy for us to subvert the content regulation regimes of other countries. Now that's interesting. So again, thinking symmetrically here, imagine when we complain about the Russians and their meddling, what did the Russians and the Chinese think about Hillary Clinton's Internet Freedom Initiative? Because they poured $100, $200 million into promoting and developing and disseminating censorship circumvention technologies. So again, the Internet Freedom thing got us caught up into interstate rivalries and geopolitics. So, in case you can't read it, the lower line there says state action versus private action. So the key factor affecting freedom of expression and content regulation now in the internet is that it's all governed by what we call platforms. Platforms are multi-sided markets in which the operator of a platform, such as Google or Twitter, brings together people for the exchange of information or value in some way. So eBay is a platform, Alibaba is a platform, Facebook is a platform. They just made so much out of this platform model. Now the question is, they are an intermediary. You are communicating through them. You're not communicating directly with your partners. You're putting information onto a platform, and the people who are also on the same platform are finding that information and filtering it. Or the platform is filtering it so that you get what you want out of it. So how much responsibility, this is the key issue in content regulation, how much responsibility does the intermediary have for what you or I put up on their platform? Now the original liberal position is primarily focused on state actors. The First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law. You go back to that historical origins. It's about keeping the state away from religion, away from private, peaceful forms of expression. Indeed, in this liberal view, a private actor has every right to discriminate and censor their own publications. Indeed, that's part of their own freedom of expression. So for example, if you send me a blog post, Olivier, for the Internet Governance Project blog, and I say, I'm not going to publish this, I'm not being a censor. I'm a private actor who is maintaining an editorial policy regarding my own publication. So then, in this world of gigantic platforms, what does censorship mean, particularly when the governments are putting all kinds of pressure on the platforms to engage in various forms of content regulation? Indeed, it's easy to overstate the problem here because we all accept as a matter of course that private actors have the right to filter and select what information they want to see, right? I mean, that's what you're doing when you set up your Facebook so that you follow certain people and you don't follow others, right? You're saying, I don't care what that guy over there tweets. I want to see what this person tweets. You're filtering them out. You're setting up your own filters. And corporate networks. How many of you are using or running a network run by a major corporation? Like a university or a business? Yeah, so what is your organization?
I'm always at USC, so but I'm painted in the office, so I'm like, I play both roles.
University of Southern California?
Yeah.
Okay, so a university network. Now you can bet that, well, I don't know for sure, but the last university I was at, they had a Palo Alto router that filtered out BitTorrent. You just couldn't use BitTorrent on their network. Why? Because they got tired of handling DMCA requests, Digital Millennium Copyright requests. They didn't want to rat on their students, but under the law they were supposed to, if they got a complaint, they were supposed to report, and follow up on this, and that gets very expensive when you have, let's say, 10,000 students and 5,000 of them are downloading files on BitTorrent. So they just said, the heck with this, it's our network, no BitTorrent.
Actually, on this university's network, there's port filtering. So port 80 works, and actually it goes through a proxy as well. And the other ports don't. So POP, SMTP, all this stuff doesn't work.
And port filtering is, maybe that's spam related, I don't know, but there's various reasons that you might want to filter one port or another. And yeah, so as a private management issue, we just say, essentially this is your private property, just like you can set rules as to who enters your building or not, you can set rules regarding what goes in and out of your network. But it's obvious that these major platforms have kind of a public character in the sense that these are the newspapers and mass media of our time. So in the earliest days, the optimistic view was that this was going to be an easy problem to solve. The World Wide Web Association came up, or actually it wasn't the W3C, it was a new organization called the Internet Content Rating Association, or ICRA. And they came up with a PIX standard, which they tried to get standardized through the IETF. I thought it was Platform Internet Content Selection or something like that, PICS. And they said, all right, you can just put a bunch of filters into your browser software and you can decide how much of this stuff you're going to see and how much you're not going to see. Does anybody tell me what the problem turned out to be with that approach?
We comply.
What?
Is it self-regulation?
Well, every individual was a self-regulator, so this was the ideal liberal world in the sense that
So it doesn't work.
every individual decides for themselves what they want to filter, and they set their own filters on their browser, and then the people creating content put categorizations on their content, and they would have an incentive to accurately classify themselves so that if you didn't want their content, you wouldn't get it.
So even if they classified themselves, they probably did it in a couple different categories to get around the filter.
Yeah, the incentive of a content person to actually classify themselves accurately is a bit questionable. But that actually wasn't the main problem. The main problem was scalability on the content production end. Think about how many websites now are generating content on the fly by the millisecond. How do you classify things? There's not like some little newspaper printer sitting there and printing out a press and putting a stamp on it. It's just millions of pages, and particularly in a user-generated content environment of a platform, you have no idea what's being put on there, right?
Yeah, but can we say that the owner of the website can, at the beginning, classify himself?
So they might apply that. That would have to apply a very crude category to the entire website, right? And that is not going to do the trick. So let's say you're a news site. Let's suppose you're CNN. Let's suppose at some point somebody engages in a grisly murder and you try to report on it. Well, okay, so that means that you're going to put a highly violent rating in there, and that means it applies to your entire website so that nobody can read recipes from the TV food critic.
one of the tough conflicts with the Native American community that I support is when we put adult content filters on libraries and schools, they can't get to their own internet. So their own economic development projects are off limits on their internet.
Exactly. Things like casinos might be considered racy and difficult for some people and not to others. And yeah, the categorization problem is just enormous. And it just doesn't scale. It just doesn't scale. There's just too much being generated day by day, second by second, particularly on a platform where users are generating most of the content. Another, a V-chip. How many of you have even heard of the V-chip? Talk about failures. So the V-chip was something that you were supposed to be able to program your video cassette recorder to not be able to play things that parents didn't want their kids to see. And the problem was that parents, nobody knew how to program the damn VCRs, right? But sufficiently to actually activate the rating. So that was a failure. How about the XXX top-level domain? Isn't it great that all the pornography got segregated into XXX? Yeah, that didn't work either. So what does work? Well, some of these private content control technologies, basically they have web crawlers and they go out and they classify websites based on algorithms, millions of websites, and then they put them into a user interface that allows you to, as a corporate network, to say, I don't want my employees watching sports programs while they're at the desk. They're supposed to be working on something boring like, handling bank loan applications. So why would they need to watch ESPN? Or maybe, you're a baseball fan, you say it's okay to watch baseball but not football. That really. But you can be that fine-grained about this, right? And those kind of work in the sense that they do some crude classifications and can block, things, but they can't block according to legal standards. And the more problematic part of it is that some of these things that are meant for private networks are then sold as technologies to governments who then try to deploy this as means of censoring content within their own country, so that it would make the internet service providers all adhere to these kind of standards. And that would mean that legally the criteria, the standards used for blocking content are not legal anymore. They're algorithmic, they're operational. It's based on whatever blue coat decides is a pornographic website. So ultimately, the real work of content regulation is essentially privatized. It is the big platforms deciding, how much heat do we want to take? What creates a nice environment for our customers and users? And we will develop our own algorithms to filter things. And usually this is a little bit passive in that it's frequently driven by public outrage over one thing or another, right? So today the outrage is about misogynistic comments on platform X. And so, Facebook has a big meeting and they say, we're not going to allow misogynistic comments, and then you have to decide what goes over the line. So they develop an algorithm that kind of flags things. Tomorrow, it's conspiracy theories. How many of you watched Google get into hot water over conspiracy theory videos?
The YouTube ones for Department students, right?
Right. Well, that was the most outrageous one probably. But even with the months before Parkland, there were, you would search for some controversial thing, and because of the intensity of interest of conspiracy theory buffs, these weird conspiracy theory videos would pop up in the list of recommended views. And everybody would blame Facebook for that. Now the question is, do you want to blame Facebook for that? Or are they just running some kind of an algorithm that impersonally filters things based on what they know about user behavior, and you just want to leave that alone? Or do you want to pressure them to tilt their algorithms to give what you think are socially desirable results? The floor is open for your opinion. Yes, ma'am.
So I grew up with the YouTube generation and all of the bloggers and gurus, as we call them. One of the things that I found interesting is that when they got bought out, they started doing all of these implementations, which seemed like a good idea for the people that started in the platform. But when you have something like Logan Paul and the algorithm and the fact that, yeah, YouTube as an entity is taking sides, they can actually just as well control all of this kind of conspiracy theory videos going into the suggested page, which actually makes really great revenue for them and for the content creators.
So you're implying that they like the conspiracy theories because it generates views and traffic, and that generates eyeballs and advertisers. But that's one of the things that blew up in their face was indeed that advertisers were finding that their videos, or their advertisements were appearing next to videos that were really kind of dicey, sketchy, undesirable, and they really started putting pressure on Google. So since YouTube or Google is a advertiser-driven business model, that really affected them very quickly. And that's an example of how these platforms, which are supposed to be interactive and diverse and completely outside the mainstream media, started becoming mainstream and more like broadcast television, right? Appealing to a mass audience. So is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? You think it's good?
Somehow.
Somehow it's good. How is it good? Tell us.
It depends on the content of the website. If it is harmful or, I don't know, something like that, it is good.
Okay.
If it is informative, I think it is. Not bad.
So yeah, this is a very common viewpoint and not an unreasonable one, which is that, yeah, you get the junk out. You're doing everybody a favor because the junk is just noise, it's a distraction, and it can be inflammatory, and it can really be misleading, right? On the other hand, the other view is, it's like, this is what was supposed to make the internet great, was that it had all this stuff that couldn't make it through the filters into the traditional mass media, and if you don't like it, you don't have to watch it. But, so there's two sides of this story. You had something to add to?
Yeah, I was just going to say, microphone. Okay, sorry.
Otherwise, you're not the action for us here.
It's true.
Maybe you want to give it back?
I will give it back to you. So my name is Shelley Robinson. And I was just going to say, what we're not talking about is that because they have the data, it's not a requirement to share the data. So they know what's most viewed, but there's no obligation like, why is that necessarily a useful thing? Like, we have all this data about the way humans behave, which is kind of herd mentality. And so Twitter, there's interesting, from when it started, it did not show like how many retweets something had. And then when they started showing that data and they changed everything, then people start gaming so that they get better results on the data. So I think the question then isn't even necessarily do we have to change the content, but do we have to share all of the ways to access it?
Do you know what I'm saying?
You're calling for more transparency in the data that Google collects about how things are viewed?
No, I'm saying that they don't have to share that.
They don't have
We
to
don't
share
need
it.
to know how
Okay.
many people viewed a given video necessarily.
Okay.
Or, I don't care if they show how many people, but it doesn't have to be recommended based on how many people have viewed it.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right, that's reasonable. One of the most damning charges made against the platform providers is that their algorithms are all tuned to just keep you on the platform, right? That it becomes an addictive thing, and we begin to have replays of the arguments that I heard in the 70s about television being addictive, and how kids were being brainwashed by watching television all day. So now it's the platforms are tailoring our algorithms to keep you coming back and viewing their platform, and so it's almost a public health problem. Some people are characterizing it as a public health problem. Yes?
Just have a question about that. Sort of an interesting, like, media effect, kind of, sort of like a second level media effect. So, I mean, I'm just interested in sort of thinking about the Gerber and Gross, that you were thinking about the impact of media on children, right? I've thought about it going on those two levels. Usually it's about the recommendation and the option for, but you're saying that it's not just the option for, it's also the viewing may have an impact as well, but that's been disproven already, in academic circles, so I don't know why we're talking about it again. Because Gerber and Gross already in, 1972 said that, watching television doesn't make children more violent. So is it more about the option to, or the impact of watching these, or engaging with content?
Well, I think that, I'm not sure, Gerber and Gross sort of proved that they had their cultivation theory.
Yeah, so.
Remember, I'm from the Annenberg School too.
I know.
And I was there when Gerber and Gross were doing that work. So it was all about, they would have high, medium, and low television viewers.
Yeah.
And they would show, because people who are watching all these series, they would see more crimes than in the real world. And they would show that high television viewers believed the world was more dangerous than low television viewers, that kind of thing. So it wasn't that they had been brainwashed to believe, this political opinion or that political opinion. It was more of a cultivation of attitudes that they talked about, as I understand.
Yeah, I mean, that's the original one, but it's a cultivation theory. But yeah, I'm just interested because it's the sort of second level that you're talking about, right? This idea.
Right. So I think that the argument is that the second level stuff you're talking about, or what you're calling the second level stuff, is just, the whole point is just to keep people on the platform. And that makes them watch more advertisement. It's good for the platform operator. They have no idea what the mental, cultural, or social effects are. You're on the platform, that's good. We're optimizing for that. Yeah.
I want to add for you, young lady, that, when you talk about the children, let's talk specifically about YouTube. They went through the apocalypse, and then they got hit with something really known as Elsagate, which was a platform that was filtered for children. So in terms of bringing it back to YouTube, the problem that YouTube had is that they were trying to do all these algorithms to control the system, and then basically adults found a way to make content that looked like children content, but it wasn't, to basically spook the algorithm to give them more access.
I'm going to explain what Elsagate is.
Yeah.
Okay.
You want to explain what Elsagate is?
Yes, it's
We haven't heard from you.
Yeah.
Elsagate. I've never even heard of it.
Elsagate, but it's
Yes.
smaller to mid-range YouTube content creators would make videos using characters that were marketed to kids, but they would put them in adult situations. It was really weird. Any kid that was watching it wouldn't see those situations. It was like playing in their mind, but it was not like normal playing if you were an adult watching it. Like it had Spider-Man interacting with her in really inappropriate ways.
The main character from Frozen.
Elsa, the character from Frozen, a Disney movie.
Frozen, Disney, what do you call it? Disney defacement? That's always that again is a historical thing, been going on for decades, believe me. Okay, we done? We're done.
Well, I don't want to cut you off. I mean, if people want to talk to you.
Can you repeat the word again?
I'm being censored.